Dear ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to tonight's discussion, the US, Türkiye, EU triangle between tensions and cooperation. My name is Sascha Obrecht. I'm the new director of the Karl-Renner-Institut, and it is my great honor to give you an introduction to tonight's discussion. This public debate is a final part and highlight of this year's Vienna Peace and Security Talks. Around 40 experts gathered to discuss the theme, Türkiye, an ambitious regional and global actor. The Vienna Peace and Security Talks have become sort of a tradition to us, a tradition in the most positive sense possible. It is a joint endeavor of three institutions, the Karl-Renner-Institut, the FES Regional Office for International Cooperation headed here in Vienna, and the International Institute for Peace. Many thanks for the cooperation. It has been a pleasure in the past, and I'm sure of that it will be a pleasure in the future. And without this cooperation, none of this here would have been possible. So thank you, and thanks a lot. So the question is, why is it that we focus this year on Türkiye? Well, Türkiye is an important player between Europe and the Middle East. It is located between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It is part of conflicts, but also mediator to some of them. Look at Syria, the Ukraine, Libya, the Middle East conflict, Cyprus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, or Iraq. It is a country that is experiencing a worrying authoritarian trend for years. It is also an EU candidate country, a very difficult partner for Europe, at least sometimes, and a NATO member since 1952. In the closed-door workshops we had earlier today, we discussed many aspects of the role of Turkey, such as its security role in the Black Sea region, its role in the South Caucasus, the role of Islam in Turkey's foreign policy. Turkey as a rival, a partner, or also as a potential ally to the EU, the Turkey-Greece relations, and many more. In this public panel we are having tonight, we will sharpen the analysis and draw a broader picture. We will concentrate the power triangle USA, EU, Türkiye. We'll also put a focus on Turkey and the USA as the deal makers who focus on interests, at least lately, less than on values. Also about the EU as a potential loser in this power play, and also the question if it can regain its influence as a power that advocates peace and cooperation. Which developments in the power dynamics will we see in the future between these three countries, and which role for each of the powers will play out? These are at least some of the questions that will be addressed tonight by our discussion, and it is my great pleasure to hand over the moderation now to MARYLIA HUSHCHA. She's a researcher at the International Institute for Peace. I wish you a very pleasant discussion tonight. I wish you very enjoyable chats afterwards, and thank you very much for your attention. And now, Maria, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Sascha. And I'm not yet moderating this event. This will be done by CHRISTOS, KATSIOULIS, but I'm just going also to welcome you on behalf of the International Institute for Peace and wish you a pleasant evening. And maybe just to say that this event is sort of summarizing the whole day of discussions that we held today. We spoke a lot about different aspects of Turkish foreign policy. We also discussed the relations with the European Union. And basically the overall conclusion was that Turkey is an indispensable partner for the EU, and it should be acknowledged and it should be treated as such. But of course, there are questions remaining about how to do that actually. And so I hope that this panel will also shed some light on that. And in addition to that, also speak a bit more about another dimension, a more complicated one with the United States. And Reinhard is also here with us to speak about that. And so before I hand over to CHRISTOS, finally everyone is already waiting for that, I just want to also thank our partners, the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, and specifically Sabrina Kaschewitz, who I don't see at the moment, but she's certainly in the room, and also Gerhard Marche, who is now filming me, and he's from the Renner Institute, and thank you very much for this wonderful cooperation, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening.
You on the extreme right.
Apparently you are on the...
Okay, whatever you want.
Like this?
Yeah.
Or,
Wonderful. I wait until the microphones that are making a weird noise are gone. Welcome also from my side. I'm doing the thanks later. We had a lot of thanks right now. And I'm very glad that the questions that Sasha raised, and MARYLIA as well, don't need to be answered by myself. My head is spinning after this day and this workshop. There is a Greek expression that says, my head is a boiling pot, and that's exactly the case right now. And what we try to do is convey some of the discussions to you that we had all over the day, so that you don't leave with a spinning head, but maybe a clearer idea of how European security is conducted right now. How is world politics conducted? How is our future right now shaped by powers like the United States, by powers like Turkey, and by the European Union? And I have a wonderful panel to answer these quite easy sounding but very difficult to answer questions. I have AHMET SÖZEN from the Eastern Mediterranean University in Cyprus here. I have Amanda Paul from the European Policy Center on the right here, and SINEM ADAR from the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin. And to my left, REINHARD KRUMM, my colleague from Washington, who's heading the office of FES in the United States and Canada. So we have perspectives from the region itself, we have perspectives from Brussels, as well as a perspective from the United States, to see how this triangle works. And when we say triangle, that sounds at the very beginning a bit weird, because the United States is in NATO, Turkey is in NATO, and most of the European Union member states are in NATO. So why is there a triangle? Why are there power dynamics? Why do we discuss about conflicting interests? And there might be conflicting interests. There are different views. The EU is not a unitary actor. But to get a better picture of what's going on, let me turn first of all to SINEM and see how in Turkey European security is perceived at the moment. When we talk about European security, we talk always about architecture. I'm more of an environment friend because I think it's a bit more fluid right now. But what is the Turkish vision of European security, and where is Turkey's place in that?
Thank you, Christos. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for the invitation again. I'll be very brief, and what I'm going to say is basically based on a project that we ran at the SVP this year, actually starting from May last year until this year. And in this project, we basically we commissioned reports on how different EU member states, as well as Ukraine and Turkey, view, on the one hand, European security and emerging European security architecture, and how they also view Turkey's potential role within this emerging European security order/architecture. And the idea that lied behind this project was to basically pinpoint the differences and the similarities among member states in order to kind of think together if it is possible to have a harmonized policy at the EU level in the kind of the making of a new European security order. Now, as far as Turkey is concerned, I think there are, kind of very briefly put, there are three components of Ankara's view of an emerging European security order. At the center of it, at an institutional basis, lies the NATO. For Turkey, NATO is the main kind of the pillar of European security. And this view is also shared by many member states that we have reports for. Secondly, Turkey wants to have an active role in the making of a new European security order. And that actually has two components. One is an active participation into European defense one component, active participation into the European defense and security mechanisms. And last but not least, of course, at the heart of Turkey's understanding of an emerging European security order lies the Black Sea. And there, of course, kind of two, I think, principles, so to speak, drive the Turkish vision. One is that Turkey is not in favor of a very strong Russia, neither it is in favor of a very weak Russia in Black Sea, and I think this is something that Turkey has with some of the member states strongly. And secondly, it is also a very strong advocate of the idea of regional ownership in Black Sea. So that basically means that countries that have a coastal line to the Black Sea should have a say in the kind of like the managing security in and around Black Sea. So that's kind of the very nutshell how Ankara sees European security.
Thank you very much. And when you say European defense mechanisms, you mean the mechanism conjured up by the European Union in response to the Russian war against Ukraine. So we have NATO as the main pillar, we have the inclusion in the defense mechanisms and the Black Sea. And you talked about the Russia perspective, nor a very weak, nor a very strong one. Ahmed, turning to you, in Vienna is also the OSCE, and the new General Secretary of the OSCE is a Turkish diplomat, a former foreign minister. What place does the OSCE have in this vision of European security in Turkey?
Right. Before answering that,
and not too long.
Not too long. Why are we talking about the triangle? Was there a triangle before, like 20 years ago? No. There was a transatlantic relationship. There was a so-called Western world, and there was a integrated security system, where NATO formed the backbone, or the backbone security umbrella. Maybe the EU is a new actor here that brings the norms and the finance, and OSCE was the sort of the dialogue tool of this whole integrated system. But now that there is Trump, after his exile, that's what he said, second time coming to power, there is a visible rift in this transatlantic relationship. What we used to know as the West, is it with us, or are we talking about two separate actors in the West? And it seems like this is the issue that we have been discussing, that on the one side you have United States under Trump, and whether this transatlantic thing will survive Trump or not is a separate question. And the idea is now that Trump drives NATO to a different direction. The Europeans are now feeling like, do we need to have our own security architecture independent of NATO? So that's the discussion. But the EU does not have that strategic outlook or that unanimity and solidarity within itself to be able to have an independent security architecture. Turkey, from the Turkish perspective, believes that there is one European security architecture, and Turkey has been part of it. It's institutional. It's been there since 1952, and Turkey prefers the continuation of that. But in the absence of, let's say, or in the weakening of NATO, let's say, in the future, this is a debate whether Turkey will side with United States or EU partners. And that's a $60 million question. Because Turkey, although today has very good relations between the two leadership, meaning Mr. Erdogan and Trump, but nonetheless, in traditional Turkish foreign policy, there are a lot of traumas regarding United States. That started with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the deal between Russia and United States, which got the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey without consulting Turkey, and then the Johnson's letters, 1964, and then embargoes on Turkey after the war in Cyprus. They create a lot of traumas vis-a-vis United States. So a lot depends on whether there will be really a European, an EU-led European security architecture that will develop. It depends a lot on that, where Turkey is going to situate itself in this triangle.
Thank you very much. And I think the picture of the triangle comes from the fact that we perceive that Europe is moving into a different direction when it comes to its security order. We come from a very unilateral order. dominant by the United States, and now this is changing. So Reinhard, the transatlantic perspective, the transatlantic alliance is at the very heart of Turkish foreign policy, and I would presume for most European Union member states it's exactly the same. But how about the other end? How is the transatlantic perspective perceived from Washington? And would the administration of Trump agree that Europe is also becoming multipolar, not only the world, but Europe itself?
Thank you for the question, and also thank you for being here on this panel, and thank you that you're here with us Monday evening. I would argue that this is contrary to conventional wisdom, that the foreign policy of the United States as of today hasn't changed that much. NATO still exists. The United States is part of NATO. The United States has still troops in Europe. They're engaged in the Russian-Ukraine war, maybe not as much as one would like to see, especially from the Ukrainian side. But it seems to be that the US is going away from being a mediator between Ukraine and the United States. Russia is in the midst of the Middle East, as we have seen today. And the United States is even interested in prolonging the New START agreement, the last agreement which we have on disarmament. So that's surprising, I guess, reading the newspapers. And I'm not saying I'm anything smarter than that. It's just, if you really look what happened, many things stay. But concerning NATO, and in general concerning the United States and having a strategy on foreign policy, you could also argue there is none, just for the sake of an argument. The Trump administration and the president itself, they're trying to fix problems. They tried that with Russia, that didn't work out, at least not yet, or with Ukraine. They tried to fix the Middle East. Hostages have been freed today, but we have no idea how long this is. And the understanding is it's a person who does that. So it's Mr. Trump, Mr. Netanyahu, Mr. Putin, Mr. Zelensky. It's not about the countries. And in that respect, the EU is highly annoying. Because Mrs. Callas, on the one hand side, or Mrs. von der Leyen, they don't have the power, according to, at least to the United States, to negotiate anything. And Mrs. Callas is not very welcome in Washington, D.C. She tries to get appointments, she's not getting it. And this has nothing to do with Mrs. Callas. This is more the Trump administration. But to your answer, I think the US is trying to reinvent itself in a different way. And I will come back to that later. Reinventing meaning, what is the role of the United States? Still a superpower. It is a very mighty country, economically and militarily, but it doesn't want to be dependent on alliances, on multilateralism. That has changed, I think. It started, not that much has changed. That seems to be changed. The UN is nothing but a headache, and it costs money, according to the administration, and the speech of Mr. Trump in New York has shown that. And anybody else is measured if he or she is willing to come to terms with the idea of an equilibrium where the United States is primus inter pares. And the US is trying hard with China and with other countries. At the very end, I think, and nobody knows this exactly, is a understanding that the bigger countries are in peaceful cooperation and the rest kind of muddles through. And the Trump administration is trying to get to that stage. And NATO so far doesn't disturb. If it is helpful, I think the administration is not clear about, but as long as it doesn't disturb, as long as they don't have to pay that much, it's all fine. So it's not that much has changed, but the intention and the path is laid so things will change. I just want to, if I might comment on you, I don't think the EU or the European pillar of NATO wants to be independent from the United States. I don't think so. They perfectly understand if the US would leave today, we have a huge problem. That's why the NATO General Secretary is using words which is painful to Mr. Trump, but the only reason he's doing that is to buy time. And we're talking about a couple of years. The German, and I stop with that, the German military is saying that Germany is fit for fight. Imagine that, a German saying that. Is fit for fight 2035. That's 10 years. Until then, we need the United States.
Thank you very much. Amanda, I heard nothing changes so much in Washington. All is fine, like Reinhard said. And a world or an equilibrium where the United States is primus inter pares sounds a lot like NATO. So what's the problem in Brussels?
I mean, to be honest, I actually agree with what has just been said. I think that the Americans, or President Trump in particular, wanted to give Europe a kick up the backside. If I may be so rude as to say that, to get them to take their own defense and security more seriously. And perhaps this is a good thing. I mean, I certainly don't believe that the US is going to be leaving Europe. And there's no signs of that. I mean, shortly there's going to be the conclusions of the US strategic posture review, I think in the next couple of weeks. So probably we'll see some rotation of some US forces, removal of some US forces, maybe some to the Indo-Pacific region. Maybe some of them are going back to the United States. But we're certainly not going to see a situation where the US retrenches from Europe. That's not going to happen. We at the EPC actually had an event a couple of days ago with the new US ambassador to NATO, who's a Trumpian guy from a different sort of background, and he pretty much said that as well. You need to continue what you've been doing. We're still not happy about the defense spending. Important progress has been made, but several European countries still need to do much more in terms of defense spending. I think what we're going to see is a very different type of European security architecture in terms of who does what. For example, Ukraine will play a crucial role in any future European security architecture. I mean, Ukraine, providing, of course, it gets the necessary military support now to survive as a sovereign state. But Ukraine will be the most powerful military force in Europe, I mean, after Turkey, basically, yeah. So that's something that's going to be new. I believe that Turkey will continue to play a very important role in European security. It already has an important role, and NATO will remain the main pillar. I mean, if you would go and ask different individual member states, do you want the EU to take over the responsibility of European security, most of them would say no. I mean, the French have sort of now and then said they would be interested in that, but it's not, I mean, it's not a realistic picture. What we're also going to see is the countries on the eastern flank, Poland, the Baltic states, playing a much bigger role, as well as Romania, and we've already seen that. So I think that European security is going through a transition from being predominantly paid for and led by the United States, which was very wrong to start with, to having a much bigger European contribution and contingent. But all of the countries that have been engaged in European security for many years will still be there, playing different roles. And this includes Turkey, because, I mean, for Turkey, Turkish security and European security, I mean, it's an interdependence. I mean, the two things are linked. So when it comes to Russia's war in Ukraine, the idea that Russia could take over the whole of the Black Sea, I mean, this probably puts a shiver down the spines of all Turks. So I would imagine that Turkey will be part of, eventually, when they get started, a number of these coalitions of the willing, once we actually get to a ceasefire situation. It's unthinkable that Turkey wouldn't, because it has the capacity, the knowledge, and the ability to play this role.
Thank you very much. You said we had a European security architecture paid for and led by the United States. So my impression is we're going to a European security architecture paid for by Europeans and led by the United States.
I wouldn't say that. I think that it will still be paid for in part by the Americans. I mean, the Americans are still paying a huge amount into this, but Europeans need to, do their share of the work and do it effectively and understand why they're doing it. Because some countries, for example, when you go down to Spain or Portugal, they still don't feel the security threat, which is why the Americans are still really hammering on them to get their, defense spending up. And I'm grateful for that, because if it wasn't for this US pressure that's coming, these threats from Donald Trump, I think our security in Europe would be in a much more fragile and dangerous situation.
Thank you very much. Because I hear a lot of agreement. We want to keep the Americans in. We want to kind of strengthen European, and when I say European, I don't mean only European Union capacities, but also including the United Kingdom as well as Turkey. Where are the friction points, SINEM? Where are the problems, since we're agreeing on the overall picture?
I prepared an answer for the shared interest. No, I'm joking. I can also talk about.
We'll come to that as well.
Points, yes. But before I come to the friction points, I just want to say a couple of words about how actually Turkey sees the Trumpian world, or the Trump world, in the context of European security. For Turkey, the moment sets in many ways an opportunity in connection to what Amanda said, because when the EU needs to do it on its own, that basically, and in connection to what Reinhard said, that with reference to Germany, it's not possible before 2035, that basically means you need to cooperate with other actors in order to be able to, in order to have the necessary capabilities and the capacity. So Turkey sees in that an opportunity, definitely, but it is also intimidated by the Trumpian world, intimidated in the sense that given the revisionist tendencies of the US under the Trump administration, that basically for Turkey means that it has to navigate an environment in which there are two revisionist great powers. One is the US, the other is Russia. And that basically means, or that kind of like makes, I think, Europe or the EU for Turkey as a kind of a nest of stability and status quo. And I think that's kind of like one of the reasons why Ankara has been, especially after the very infamous J.D. Vance speech at the Munich Security Conference and the meeting of Zelensky with Trump in the White House, Ankara has been quite forthcoming about its willingness to contribute to the EU defense and security mechanisms. Now, coming to the frictions, obviously, one very big friction point is the Eastern Mediterranean when we think of the EU-Turkey relations within the context of the future European security order. That is a friction point not only because of not necessarily aligned interests of Turkey and some of the member states, i.e. Greece, Republic of Cyprus, France, etc. It is also a friction point because of the implications of these not necessarily aligned interests between Turkey and some of the member states for Turkey's possible contribution or engagement into the EU defense and security mechanisms. Like we talked about this today at length, that's how basically the Greece and the Republic of Cyprus objections, and also I would say France as well, objections to Turkey's kind of contribution to safe mechanism, for instance. So that's one friction area. And of course, I mean, even though I said that in the first round that I see Black Sea as, like, Black Sea is of course important for Turkey, and I think there is to a certain extent a shared interest between Turkey and with many member states about the security of Black Sea and Ukraine. But of course, because of Turkey's quote-unquote balancing act, or the tendency to hedge its economic and security interests between Ukraine and Russia, that kind of, like, I think leaves a question mark for member states such as Sweden, Finland, Germany, who are actually quite willing to cooperate with Turkey in the in the making of a new European security order and architecture, but they are also not kind of dying to basically move fast. So that could potentially create a future friction. And I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ahmed, looking at the two conflict zones where we're mostly occupied with at the moment towards Ukraine and Gaza, where do you see here kind of overlapping interests between Turkey, Europe and the United States? Or would you say that there are also disagreements in these conflicts?
There are both agreements and disagreements happening at the same time. That's why it's very difficult to categorize that in this triangle there are overlaps. Because when it comes to Ukraine, it seems like the three are agreeing on certain things, but then when you see Trump, the way he treats Zelensky, you might ask yourself, yeah, is there really overlapping here or disagreements? When it comes to Syria, it's also a complicated picture. Trump congratulates Erdogan that he played a very important role in getting rid of an authoritarian regime of Assad, but at the same time, Turkey and, for example, EU does not come eye to eye when it comes to what kind of governance there will be within the future Syria. And sometimes with United States, Turkey might have frictions. It used to have frictions, especially regarding the Kurds in Syria. So it's a fluid thing. Now, why we are talking about this, again, bringing this to or tying this to the bigger picture, the way Turkey sees things, according to Turkey, we are living in a multipolar world. Or at least this is what Turkey wants to see as the world in reality. But we are not in a multipolar world order which is agreed by everybody. In a way, we are in a era where we are renegotiating. All the countries, important great powers, are renegotiating the values and the norms of the emerging system. That's why it's not accidental that, for example, for Erdogan, he made this like a slogan that the world is greater than five. You probably are aware of that. What is he talking about? He's talking about that the current system, the UN Security Council, with the permanent five, with their veto power, is not reflecting the reality of the current time, that it needs to change. So currently, the way Turkey looks at things is seeing things in a multipolar world, but simply the rules and the norms of that system is now being under discussion as we speak. It's not there yet. So that's why we don't see things in a clearer, tangible way, whether there are real frictions or real, let's say, overlaps. These are in fluid, in flux at the current stage.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to bring in Reinhard and then Amanda on the same question here. if we're in the multipolar world, and I would agree here, and the rules are unclear, and we're at the moment trying to negotiate these values and norms that kind of are like guidelines for foreign policy and international relations. What is the view in Washington, Reinhard? You said it's the big powers agreeing amongst themselves and the smaller ones have to kind of come along. Is that in short? So it's not the big five, it's the big three that need to decide, China, Russia and the US. How does it look like from there?
In general, I think it is China, Russia and the United States. But in general, the United States, the administration is very happy to have Turkey as an ad hoc partner to solve something, knowing and kind of assuming that Turkey in that instant is powerful enough to do things. Israel at the moment is powerful enough to do something in the Middle East, could have been somebody else. So this ad hoc coalition looking for a partner wherever it is in the region who is powerful enough to do something, in the best case, without an opposition. That's the best. You have to see, and this is something, you know, it's difficult to analyze the United States. First of all, because it's changing, and second of all, you have so many opinions in the United States and telling you this is how it is, and you go to the next one, it's completely different, and that's how it is. So it's not that easy. So what I'm trying now, and this is a discussion in the United States, and it's part of the answer, it seems to be that the United States is, I think I said at the beginning, reinventing itself. 1776, 1865, after the Civil War, then the New Deal in the 1930, 100 years ago almost, and the United States wants to go away from that. It's not the generous superpower anymore. And some people would argue, for me, for our country, it was never generous, but I think for Germany, for Europe, it was generous in general. They're rethinking that. And they're also rethinking then the norms. I remember for the longest time, the extension of NATO, it has to be the same norms. If we don't have the same norms, you're not getting into NATO. There was a discussion with the Baltic countries, with Poland, and so on and so forth, even though it was clear that they're close to that. What about the United States, if there are different norms? So I said at the beginning, you could argue the United States is still kind of doing the same, but they're not doing this on a very firm basis of norms and understanding which we had before. And that makes it difficult for us. It also makes it difficult for us because we are not sure if this is connected only to the current administration or that is something which people think, which the American people think, actually this is a good thing. We feel kind of used. And that, of course, is a very difficult basis for a stable continuation. So frictions are everywhere. I just want to give you one point, which is more a practical fiction with the United States. And I hear this on different topics, but especially with Ukraine, you don't have a political process. So the classical way, if you're a policy advisor, you go to the administration, you go to the Germans, you go to the Turks, to the government, whatever, you kind of try to get your way in, and there are people who say, it's interesting and I'll give it up the ladder. If you do this in the United States, the guy who should push it up the ladder will tell you, I don't know who to push this to. Actually, maybe we can discuss this. So that's a problem if you don't have this kind of political process and the administration is convinced that will take care of it because of the charisma, because of the experience, because of the power of the United States to press countries in doing something. And that is a huge friction, and it is a problem for the United States, but clearly it's a problem for us too.
Thank you very much. Amanda, the same question to you. How is this kind of multipolar world perceived from Brussels? What kind of norms and values would we like to see? And referring to Reinhard and the reinvention of the United States, how can Europe live in such a kind of reinvented world? Because the United States doesn't only reinvent itself, it reinvents somehow how world politics are being conducted, or not?
Yeah, I mean, the EU doesn't exist in a vacuum. But to be fair, I mean, there's some European countries as well who've already crossed that Rubicon, if I can say so, including some big countries like France, who've been more than willing to be part of ad hoc alliances or do things, for example, in Libya, that were not exactly in line with what we'd call the normal rules of doing things. So I think we have to also be honest with ourselves, because sometimes I have the impression that Europeans have this holier-than-thou approach. You know, the Americans or Donald Trump is off doing all these strange alliances or undermining, you know, the multilateral system or whatnot. But we also need to remember that, I mean, the system that was created all those years ago is actually incredibly unfair to many countries around the world who would like to see it changed. Whether that's going to happen vis-a-vis the Donald Trump way of doing things, I doubt it. But I think Europeans are coming to terms with the fact that the world has changed. I mean, the global order that we have known for many years, decades, has come to an end, and something else is being reshaped. The question is whether Europeans, or the EU in particular, is going to play any role in shaping this new order. That's a question I have, because it's not very clear to me that they are, because it's unfolding in front of our eyes, but we're not actually seeing how the EU is actually shaping that, because you either shape or you're shaped. So the EU can be at risk of being shaped rather than actually doing any of the shaping. So I think we're in a particularly dangerous time. So we need to get into this boat as quickly as possible.
Yeah, two fingers, but very short, because I wanted to go back. On the Europeans getting into the boat, Reinhard mentioned that there's no political process in the United States at the moment. The European Union is the definition of political process. So how do you fare the chances of the European Union making it into this kind of boat in very rocky waters?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, they need to show the determination to be part of this. They need to stand up and be counted. I mean, and this should be done not just on an individual basis, but by the EU as a whole. But this brings us back to the question of who actually runs the EU, right? Because at the moment, what we're seeing is a competition between different leaders to have that role. I mean, von der Leyen wants to be the woman that is seen as being in charge, calling Donald Trump the woman that's got all the answers. But the other two also want to have that role. So I think there's a lot of internal thinking that needs to be done, a lot of internal reflection over how the EU actually sees its role in the world or in this new system, because actually it's not very clear to me that they do see this at all in a coherent or clear way.
Thanks a lot. Reinhard.
Yeah, very short. I think in Germany, and I assume in Austria it's the same, and of course in Turkey and in Brussels, it is understood what you all explained, that we are kind of in a moment of a watershed moment. But that's my impression, at least in Germany, and in the US it is very clearly understood, but I just want to bring Germany in since I'm from Germany. What to do about this is very unclear, and I think that's the same in Austria. And I would just press the point you made, it depends on us. It's not that because the United States is saying certain things and a missing political process, that doesn't mean that in general, it really depends on us to have on a certain level talks what we can bring in. Because at the moment, for the United States, the EU is a complete failure. And I'm not saying that's what it is, I'm just saying that's the impression. They're not doing enough. So any talk on the Middle East is in general without the EU. Any talk on Russia is without the EU. And if you talk to people who are open-minded towards the EU, they still ask, so why should we invite you? And we had this discussion, and there was silence.
Thanks a lot. Sinem and then Ahmed. And maybe because it depends on us, and the question is, what can we bring to the table? Maybe we could also bring in power resources of Europe into the discussion.
Before I come to that, I just want to say something about multipolarity and Turkey, because I have a little bit of a different opinion on that. I mean, it's true that that has been the assumption that drove Turkish foreign policy, particularly starting from 2014, that the West is in decline and the challengers such as Russia, Iran, China are on the rise. And I think Turkey capitalized on that reading of the world quite significantly, and that's what we talked today during the workshop about being able to fill the power vacuums. I am not sure, however, whether that's still the view, since the Trump administration has started the job at the beginning of this year. Because, I mean, how do you understand that you live in a multipolar world, right? You basically look into the regions that you are active in, that you have a stake in, that you have an interest in, and then you kind of read the shifting power dynamics there. And when you look at the neighboring regions of Turkey, that is anything but multipolar, especially if you look at the Middle East, especially after the Israeli attack on the Iranian embassy in Damascus and then the killing of the senior leaders of Hezbollah, Hamas, etc., that's a clear military and intelligence dominance of Israel backed by the US. So it is no longer a multipolar world in the Middle East, in my opinion, as far as Ankara is concerned. That is also the case in Black Sea, especially at the beginning, I would say, and that's why that's what I alluded to with this kind of the emphasis on the revisionist, the US, because I don't think Turkey is happy seeing a US that empowers Russia in Black Sea. So in that sense, kind of having the challengers weakened is far from having a multipolar world in the neighboring regions, in my opinion. And in that sense, also the Turkey-US relations, I mean, my reading of I'm not an expert on the US, so that's kind of like coming from a lay person, right? Like my reading of the Trump administration is that you have an administration that is determined to reconfigure power dynamics that has changed at the global level. And the kind of the guilty parts for that is the hyperglobalization, that all the expectations that US would basically remain at the top of the pyramid collapsed. It is no longer top of the pyramid. And in order to undo that, you need to basically resort to hard and very raw power. And as you do that, you also need to change alignment patterns. And I think basically the US's relationship with Turkey under the Trump administration, that's the lens basically through which I read the changing kind of US-Turkey, the dynamics in the US-Turkey relationship. And there I see like two issues very important. One is the Trump administration's ambition to maintain the US's energy dominance. And there the keyword is basically the Turkish purchase of LNG from the US. So, I mean, that applies to Europe as well. And if you basically think of who is really the biggest winner of the war in Ukraine, that's actually the US, because it is able to basically sell LNG to Europe, to Turkey, to so many different actors. And I think the willingness to cooperate with Turkey in different theaters, be it in the Middle East, be it in Africa, has also significantly to do with the desire to further contain Iran and Russia.
Thank you very much. Ahmed, you wanted to come in?
Yeah.
And your mic.
Okay, to use a layman's terms, I think that the EU was caught while its pants were down during this very critical moment. Okay, to put it more politely, I think that the EU was caught unprepared in this critical moment, that it has not sufficiently completed its deepening to the extent that it can act with one voice. So it's still a pretty intergovernmental organization. And in this day and age where we have been going through tectonic changes, all the values and the norms of the previous system, where the Europeans were part of, meaning I'm talking about the post-Cold War, post-World War II, so-called liberal, so-called global system, which is based on democracy, rule of law, open markets, and multilateralism. All these tenets are in tatters, and not just in Europe or United States, but everywhere. I mean, we are going through this democratic backsliding, or what Huntington calls third wave reverse, and we don't know how we are going to end up, and whether the Europeans will continue advocating these values. Is there any sign that EU as a whole, all these member states, still on the same page when it comes to democracy, when it comes to rule of law, when it comes to open markets, when it comes to multilateralism? This is the challenge that we are seeing, that the EU doesn't have a strategic position on this as a whole, as one unity, in one solidarity, and that's why it is very difficult to for the EU to how shall I put it, to act independently and sort of prepare a new, for example, security architecture, let alone all these foreign policies, independent of the United States. So reality tells us that it depends on the NATO's at least security umbrella for some more time, but it has to make hard choices as to, in the new, let's say, multipolar system, what will be the values and the norms that the Europeans will support and advocate. Let's say in the sense that if United States drifts away from these values, the very values and norms that it played a leading role in establishing, where will the Europeans be? And specifically, where will the EU be? Because when we say Europeans and EU, we are not talking about the same thing, right? Do we include, for example, United Kingdom within Europe? It's not in the EU anymore. So all these are in flux now.
Before I give the question on the values of the Europeans to Amanda, you said Europe were caught with its pants down. So Turkey wasn't. Turkey was better prepared for that world, and why?
Turkey was not, Turkey is a middle power. And whenever there are all these uncertainties or all these dramatic changes, the middle powers are, I think, better positioned. They have more area of maneuver in terms of coping with the changes. That's why Turkey has been, and this isn't something new. Turkey had that kind of hedging and balancing act that started way before. At the beginning of my intervention, I talked about some of the traumas that Turkey had specifically towards United States, starting from the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then the Johnson's letter, the Cyprus problem, and all that. And Turkey had these initiatives at the all times in the 60s, 70s, to try to develop a kind of multi-vector, a more, let's say, autonomous foreign policy, and not being sort of the, how shall I put it, not being shaped by the shapers. So in that sense, I believe that Turkey was better prepared. If you look at the relations of Turkey with the United States now, or if you look at Turkey's relationship with Russia, Putin, and whatnot. It seems like Turkey is, in my opinion, benefiting from this system or these changes or uncertainties.
Thank you very much. Amanda, as a Brit, the idea of being flexible and nimble might sound very familiar to you after Brexit, but let's go to the values and norms of the European Union. And I ask also you here in the audience to prepare already your questions, because I'll give the floor to you shortly. But we mentioned democratic backsliding a few times now. We see it in Turkey. We fear it in the United States at the moment. We see it also in some European states, as you said very clearly, and rightly so. So what is the European Union standing for anymore? Or are we standing for something together? Or are we just kind of in a reaction mode?
I mean, I think a number of mistakes have been made, which has undermined the EU's image as, you know, an upstanding democratic actor. I mean, obviously, most recently, the EU's position vis-à-vis Gaza. I mean, it's had a devastating impact on the EU, to be honest, as a union, but also individual member states who have been silent, incoherent in any other, you know, negative thing that eroded their image as this, you know, upstanding actor of fundamental rights and freedoms and whatnot. I mean, that's been a major problem. The other issue is related again to the rise of the far right in many member states, as well as in the UK, I could say. In part, I would say this has been down to Russian disinformation. I mean, hybrid warfare and disinformation has had a huge impact in a number of countries. I mean, it's not the only reason, but it's played into, you know, existing issues in those countries, which have come about in part due to migration. I mean, migration has been used by the far right in many countries in the EU. On the eastern flank, we've seen it, you know, in Hungary, in Poland, in Slovakia, in Romania, but also in France and elsewhere, which has been manipulated, particularly around this issue of traditional values being eroded, which has been used over and over again in different election campaigns, which, as I said, has been used by the Russians in disinformation to get rid of different leaderships in replace for far-right governments. So I think it's a combination of these two things, and the EU hasn't been able to have a quick enough response to these things. I mean, also the Green Deal I think the Green Deal has been pushed down people's throats too quickly, that is actually backfired as well, and has been manipulated. So I think it's a sort of a combination of internal developments and the failure to have a coherent EU response to some things that have undermined the EU as a sort of rules-based fundamental actor.
Thank you very much. I would probably add a few issues here coming from the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung about social inequality and the issues of social cohesion and kind of distribution of wealth inside the European Union. But going a bit away from these internal problems, why do you think there is no kind of initiative by the European Union to go very clear on this kind of rules-based international order based on the UN Charter? Because this is something not only Europeans can agree on, it's something most countries also of the region we call usually the Global South can agree upon, because also they don't want to be part of this kind of world where everybody's being pushed around by the big ones.
I mean, I think it's because there's no common position on it. That's what it boils down to. I mean, some member states are more than happy to be part of these new sorts of alliances. I mean, you would think of, Hungary is obviously the one we all talk about, but it's not just Hungary. I think there's a growing desire to actually have, feet in different camps. If there is, economic interest, strategic interest, or things to be gained by doing this. And as the EU has enlarged, this has become more problematic.
Thank you very much. I'll open the floor now for the public. Just let me say a few things about your questions. It need to be questions, no monologues. If you talk more than 2 minutes, I'll cut you short, and I'll be very hard on that. We want to have an exchange, a very open exchange. So please, if you have a question, state your name, maybe the person on the panel you want to ask the question to, and then you'll get the microphone. Who wants to go first? I saw Ambassador Ildem already. So if we have a microphone here, and then on the left.
Well, I don't have a particular question, but it was such a good exchange that I wanted to add with one idea.
A very short idea.
Absolutely. I think we shouldn't go to wrong directions in terms of European security architecture that we are going to build. And it requires not only the European Union's effort, because Europe is going beyond the European Union. That's why we have OSCE with 57 participating states. But one question, and you put it very rightly, is rules and principles. And nobody is talking about it. All legally and politically binding instruments that underpinned European security have shattered. And now there should be a consensus. And in order to reach that, Europeans and Americans, because transatlantic bond is extremely important, and the United States is part of Europe because of the presence of American military, there should be a reflection period. This is what I wanted to...
Thank you very much. And the gentleman on the left? Yes.
Yeah, my question is regarding Turkey and their foreign policy. So, I'm not a Turkey expert, I'm not a nothing expert, but my conception of Turkey is a country which has a very compartmentalized foreign policy. So whoever they're turning towards, they will have a different set of principles and different interests in mind. And so if we think of their military-industrial complex, they will turn to Russia when they need to, they will turn to the EU when they need to. How should the EU manage this? The fact that Ukraine has been held by Turkey, but at the same time, Turkey has been used to circumvent sanctions for many of critical material that the Russian industry needed. So how should the EU look at this if, on the one side, the US is already being perceived as unreliable, and Turkey also has this multifaceted foreign policy?
Thank you very much. Next question is the gentleman in the second row here, and then Hannes.
My name is Wolfgang Wiedl. Maybe a little bit provocative. To what degree should we, at least on the long run, consider Russia part of Europe? It's the largest country on European soil.
Thank you very much. And the microphone, Hannes, did you want to, or?
Thank you. I've only one question. How do you estimate the role of military strengths to be politically strong? If we look now to Gaza, what the US is delivering weapons to Israel, to Egypt, to Qatar, and of course it has a strong influence. Turkey is exporting weapons, has a strong army, has a strong influence. So unfortunately, because as a European, peacemaker or whatever, I deplore that situation, but can Europe be strong without having a strong military capacity? That is my question.
Thank you very much. And the last question in the lady back there.
Thank you very much, Marina Vorotnyuk, Defense and Security Think Tank, RUSI from London. So my question is, I was listening to very complex discussions on polarity, multipolarity, unipolarity, multilateralism, etc. And to bring even more confusion here, while I was listening, I was thinking that contemporary European security order is actually revolving around minilateralism, in my opinion, which is the small coalition of states security formats, which is, in my opinion, is the most efficient, filling the gaps and successful formats demonstrated so far, especially since 2022, Russia's war in Ukraine. Just the examples: Nordic Baltic, Joint Expeditionary Force plus UK, Poland, and Baltic. Again, so what's your take on that? Is this the way, because while the security order is fractured and very likely not to be patched very soon, we are to witness actually coalitions of the willing of this source, thematic coalitions of smaller states like Estonia, which allows them to punch above their weight in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I think we have a very broad range now. I'll stop here because otherwise the panel will be overwhelmed by these questions. And I'll start from Reinhard. We have the question on the rules and principles of the OSCE and the kind of question, how can we come to a consensus, how to deal with this opportunistic, compartmentalized foreign policy of Turkey, Russia as part of Europe, then military power as the only power resource that is kind of worth something right now, and the minilateralism question. You pick and choose.
The rules and norms of the OSCE. I mean, Ambassador, you have been to the OSCE, you know the discussion on that and how far it all goes. I think that on the podium, it seems to be all very clear that, you know, and you said it, the European security is in tatters. Is it? I mean, is it completely gone? We are sitting here. I wouldn't say it's completely gone. It's in the process of being...
the decision making as one body is in tatters, not the security. They are still under NATO, by the way.
What I'm saying is we still have security in wider parts of Europe, not in Ukraine, not in other parts. But I'm saying is we see something coming up, but we still have something. We haven't destroyed what we have. Why, are you sitting here in peace or not? And just, no, I'm now here. You had your podium. So what I'm saying is it depends. I don't think now is the time to come together and talk about rules and norms. I think that will be extremely difficult. Now everybody is on its own. The US is trying this, Russia, unfortunately, trying this with military means, and other countries trying this very differently. Right now, I cannot see, and that's what I'm saying, the OSCE tried this and is still trying to get this all together to come back to the Paris Charter, but I don't see this at the moment. We shouldn't give up on that. I think think tanks should go on. What we did today is something in that order, absolutely. But I feel if we start with that, it's extremely difficult. I think we are now at a time to make sure that the world is not blowing up, and that needs a lot of initiatives from politicians, and I think it is still in our hands. It is not Germany in 1930. We do have the means, we do have politicians who could do things, we have think tanks, we're in a different situation. But I also wanted to tell you, this is new. This is not something we had before, because it's beyond Europe. Then I would like to say something about small coalition within. On the one hand side, during the Ukraine war, especially those countries closer to the war zone put a lot of initiative into supporting Ukraine. That is absolutely right. But at the same time, also the bigger countries. You have the forward presence of the UK, of France, of Germany. Germany is building up a brigade. Yes, initiatives can come and should come, but in general, it should be all agreed. Otherwise, we have... Otherwise, I think we do have a problem. I'll leave it here.
Thank you. Ahmed.
You said pick and choose.
Pick and choose.
Okay. Well, I agree with Reinhard that what we are discussing here is much bigger than Europe. We are talking about a global systemic change from post-Cold War, US-led, rules-based, so-called liberal, so-called global international order to something else. And that's beyond Europe. Europe has to decide, or European Union has to decide, whether it's going to be playing a role in this, in shaping the rules and the norms and the values of the new system, or it will be shaped, as Amanda put it. So this is, as I said, much bigger than European Union. To what degree Russia is part of Europe? I think it's an excellent question. And I wish that you were today or last night part of the discussion where I raised the issue of the 1990s. I looked at those good old days, early 1990s, the end of the history moment and all that, and there was discussion in the 90s of possible Russia's EU membership. Remember? Some of us do remember that. And Turkey also belonged to that, and Ukraine and whatnot, no problem. But we are far away from that early 1990s. In the early 1990s, there was no Gaza, there was no Ukraine. The number one news item, Clinton, Monica Lewinsky, sex scandal. So it was much better world than today in that regard. Unfortunately, we are in an age, what Hannes says or asks, whether you are really strong without a military might. I'm a liberal myself. So, I mean, I'm not somebody who would support huge armies, strong armies and whatnot, but unfortunately, we are going through this very hyper-securitized system or era where realpolitik really matters, and having a strong army and sort of imposing yourself is important. So, long story short, the EU cannot just champion principles and ideas without real power. So it has to, in my opinion, prepare for that too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sinem.
I'll take the question about compartmentalized Turkish foreign policy and how should the EU deal with it, and the militarist and political influence one. I mean, I don't have a very good answer to the first one, but I'll give it a try. And I have kind of like three issues that immediately come to my mind. First, I would say do not overreact and not lost in the moment, because I remember when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, and then when Turkey didn't join the EU sanctions, that was like a extremely emotional discussion. But then a year after, the tone of the discussion, at least among the experts, changed. As it turns out, it was actually not that very bad to have someone in the room who could actually speak to both parts. Because, I mean, if you walk towards eventually peace, right, to resolve the conflict, you need actors who could basically speak with both parties. So, second, I would separate issues. Like the Turkish official narrative is that it only joins UN sanctions, it doesn't join EU sanctions. Now, one could criticize that position, especially given that it's a candidate country, but I think there is something in the argument, given that, because the argument basically, or the argument follows continues in the following way, like we do not have a seat in deciding how those sanctions are, or shaping how those sanctions are decided. And I think it's an argument to basically hear. It's not a completely void argument, in my opinion. So separate issues. And third, be consistent. I mean, obviously circumventing, so separate issues, basically Turkey not joining the EU sanctions, I think should be dealt separately from Turkey circumventing sanctions, for instance, and that is, in my opinion, the red line. But then that should be a red line for each and every country that circumvents sanctions. So be consistent. And that consistency argument, another pillar of that, in my opinion, also adherence to alliance principles, I would say. At the very beginning, I was surprised when you said a potential ally for the EU. I mean, potential partner I could understand, but potential ally, given that it is already within NATO, and then most of the EU countries are within NATO. So they are already allies, as a matter of fact. So it can't really be a potential ally. It could be a potential partner, and I can understand where that the emphasis on potential comes from, given the erosion of trust in for very understandable and right reasons. But in that sense, I think consistency really matters for both sides. The military strength, political influence. I mean, I think military strength can be translated into political influence if you want to translate it into political influence, yeah? Because at the end of the day, for me, military strength is useful for defense, obviously. I mean, if you are kind of facing an actor that doesn't know the boundaries, etc., and then you need to defend yourself, so you need military strength. Military strength is useful for deterrence, and then military strength could also be used as leverage, and I think the leverage part actually is related to political influence. Now, under the current circumstances, I think obviously Europe needs to build up military capabilities and capacities for defense and deterrence. But I'm not sure whether the third element, military strength for political influence, i.e. military strength as a leverage to basically kind of to gain political influence and to expand influence, etc. I would be a little bit... I remember the cautious, exactly. I would be a little bit cautious on that one.
Thank you very much. Amanda.
I also agree that Europe can't be strong without having a strong military capacity. I mean, Europe is already at war. Many people don't see that because the war is taking place in Ukraine, but we are at war. And we should remember that tonight, or that today, hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers will die, first to protect their country, to actually make sure that Ukraine remains an independent sovereign state. But also they die to prevent the Russian aggressors coming much closer to EU borders. And I think it's important that we remember that. At the same time, Russia is also conducting a hybrid war across the whole of Europe. I think the last few weeks have showed us that. The number of Russian drones that have appeared in different member states, the number of Russian incursions into NATO member state airspace should be a very strong signal that Europeans need to do much more to strengthen their own military capacity. I think it's very positive that Europe has taken many steps to take more responsibility. I mean, a number of new initiatives have been developed. I mean, we've talked about the rearm, military mobility, and now the SAFE. Europeans are spending much more money on defense. It's slow, but it's happening. And also in other areas which are also important in terms of civil preparedness. I mean, it's very important that politicians across Europe really give the message to their populations about the threats that are emanating from Russia, but from other actors in the world as well. I mean, for example, China or whatnot. So prepare civilian populations for potential situations. I mean, this has been done particularly well in the Baltic states, in Poland and elsewhere, but I think even some countries further into Europe are doing it. and also building up the resilience of, for example, on critical infrastructure and whatnot. I mean, there's many lessons that can be learned from Ukraine in this respect. And I think other initiatives, for example, the Sky Shield is crucial. I mean, the Sky Shield will be like a big sort of, dome. I mean, some people have compared it to the Iron Dome, but I mean, that might be a bridge too far to protect Europe from drones and other sorts of, weapons that the Russians or others could do, as well as things like this drone wall or all the joint sort of cooperation that's now going on between different countries. But as I started with, we are at war. That needs to be recognized at every level, and then the necessary steps need to be continued to be taken.
Thank you very much. We're coming to an end, but before I leave you to a glass of wine, I'd like to summarize a few issues and then ask you one question at the panel here, and I would love it if you could answer in one sentence. We saw that it's not as easy as we presented it in the outline. It's not a real triangle. There's a lot of cooperation still. There is tension as well, but the whole ground beyond the triangle is moving. It's beyond Europe, as has been said. The rules are being rewritten, and we want to be the ones writing the rules in Europe, or co-writing the rules at least. We want to shape and not being shaped. So, and somebody said it depends on us. I'll start with you, Amanda. If it depends on us, what should we do concretely to not being shaped?
I mean, I think we need to start with having a common position on things of strategic importance, and in many cases that isn't the starting point. So we need to have a much bigger political will to actually have one position on many things and then drive those issues forward quickly.
Thank you very much. One position. Sinem.
I would actually repeat what you said, but you posed as a question whether Europe is reactionary. Don't be reactionary and have a kind of a strategic vision.
Thank you very much. Get out of reaction, go into action. Ahmet.
Exactly. Be creative and aim towards this supranational body that once the founders of the EU visioned for European Union.
Thanks a lot. Reinhard. Be calm. And use a microphone.
Be calm. Be calm and not carry on. No, I didn't want to say that. No, be calm and take the initiative.
Thank you very much. And I would also add, to not leave you as bleak with the sentence, only military is the real power resource. Military relies on economic strength, it relies on social cohesion, it relies on the will of our societies to defend what we're standing for. And that is something very peculiar and unique in Europe. And I'd like to end with that because I know, and we had this in discussion today with our Turkish friends, that is something we share with a very big part of the Turkish civil society. And with that, hopefully a bit more positive note, I would like to thank the panel very, very much. They earned a big applause, please.